Let's dive right into this explainer and unpack a truly mind-blowing piece of history. We're talking about the breathtakingly fast collapse of the Soviet Empire. Seriously, between 1985 and 1991, one of the world's absolute greatest superpowers completely unraveled. So, let's find out exactly how that happened.
To understand this massive, monumental shift, we're going to walk through 6 pivotal stages. We'll kick things off with Gorbachev's new thinking, then look at the Sinatra Doctrine, opening the Iron Curtain, the fall of the wall, revolutions across Eastern Europe, and finally, the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union.
First off, we really need to wrap our heads around the sheer speed of this era. A frozen, decades-long military standoff literally melted away almost overnight. In just 6 short years, from Gorbachev taking power to the dissolution of the entire state, the geopolitical map of the world was totally rewritten.
All right, starting things off with part 1, Gorbachev's new thinking.
So picture it, it's 1985, and Mikhail Gorbachev inherits a Soviet economy that is just totally drained by the arms race. He realizes that to save this failing communist system, he's got to do something drastic. So he introduces 2 radical policies. First up is perestroika, which basically meant restructuring the economy to make it more efficient. And then there's glasnost, meaning openness. Suddenly, for the first time, everyday citizens could read previously banned books and actually criticize the government without fear of being thrown in jail. It was a huge deal.
And then, Gorbachev does something completely unexpected. He explicitly signals to the rest of the world that the threat of military force is no longer a tool for Soviet foreign policy. During a 1988 speech at the UN, he absolutely shocked the international community by declaring that freedom of choice is a universal principle. Just like that, the Soviet military grip was officially loosening.
Which brings us to part 2, the Sinatra Doctrine.
This new thinking had an immediate, profound impact on the Eastern European satellite states. Moscow basically abandoned the old rulebook that let them use Soviet tanks to crush democratic reforms. It got to the point where a Soviet spokesperson actually joked on U.S. television that they were now following the Sinatra Doctrine, like the famous Frank Sinatra song, My Way. The idea was that now every Warsaw Pact country could forge its own path, doing things their way without any fear of a Soviet invasion.
Okay, moving right along to part 3, opening the Iron Curtain.
By the spring of 1989, things start snowballing. Gorbachev's top-down policies were inadvertently triggering these massive grassroots movements. In May, Hungary physically tore down the fence along its border with capitalist Austria. And that one single hole in the Iron Curtain, it sparked a total chain reaction. Over 100,000 East Germans migrated right through Hungary to escape to the west. The East German government literally couldn't stop the hemorrhage of its own people, so they were backed into a corner and forced to announce much greater freedom of travel.
And that incredible momentum sets the stage for part 4, the fall of the wall.
1 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the staggering number of people who gathered in East Berlin on November 4th to demand free elections. It was the largest demonstration in East Germany's entire history, and the pressure was just immense. A few days later, a mistaken government announcement caused citizens to absolutely rush the border crossings. People were literally out there dismantling the Berlin Wall with hammers. It was completely unprecedented.
To really grasp the human side of this divide, think about a 10-year-old East German boy who crossed the border just months after the wall came down. He described his home in East Germany as run-down, sad, dirty, and smelling of burnt brown coal. But the second he stepped into West Germany, with its clean streets and well-kept, bright buildings, he said it felt like he was on another planet. That stark, everyday economic reality is exactly why millions were demanding change. All right, part 5, revolutions across Eastern Europe. So the wall falls, and boom, it's the ultimate catalyst. The dominoes start falling incredibly fast across the Warsaw Pact. In Poland, the previously banned trade union, Solidarity, ends up winning a landslide election. Over in Czechoslovakia, massive protests lead to the completely peaceful Velvet Revolution. But we have to remember it wasn't all peaceful. Down in Romania, the brutal dictator Ceausescu absolutely refused to step down. That led to a really violent uprising and, ultimately, his execution by firing squad.
Which brings us to our final act, part 6, the Soviet Union collapses.
Now this is where things get incredibly ironic. The loss of all those satellite states ricocheted right back to Moscow and created this fascinating paradox. In the West, Gorbachev was an absolute hero. He even won the 1990 Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Cold War standoff. But back at home, totally different story. He was treated with deep suspicion. Hardline communists viewed him as a total villain who ruined the economy and just surrendered Eastern Europe.
All that unrest finally boils over in August of 1991, which really was the final death knell for the Soviet system. A group of hardliners known as the Gang of Eight organized a sudden coup. They placed Gorbachev, who was on vacation, under house arrest and declared a state of emergency. But then Boris Yeltsin boldly steps up. He calls the new government illegal and actually rallies the people of Moscow right from the top of a tank. The coup completely collapsed after just 3 days, but at that point, Gorbachev's central authority was permanently shattered.
So the central authority is fatally wounded, and the cement holding the Eastern Bloc together just dissolves. The Warsaw Pact officially ended its military cooperation. And seizing this incredible moment, 12 Soviet republics, starting with the Baltic states like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, demanded total independence. The Soviet Empire was literally fracturing from the inside out.
And finally, on Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev officially announced his resignation. He openly acknowledged that the totalitarian system had been eliminated, and with that, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist. It peacefully fractured into several independent states, closing the book on one of the most tense, high-stakes chapters in all of modern human history.
So I'm going to leave you with this to chew on. A massive, nuclear-armed superpower dismantled itself from the inside out in a matter of just 6 years. When we look at the borders, the alliances, and the political tensions in Europe today, how much of that map is still defined by the echoes of 1991? It's a huge question. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep asking questions about the history that shapes our world today.